The renowned auditorium at Harvard Law School shifted into a tense, expectant quiet when Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan suddenly veered away from her prepared remarks and delivered a surprisingly forceful critique aimed straight at Representative Jasmine Crockett. This annual high-level lecture on congressional power dynamics had drawn an overflowing crowd of students, faculty, and legal experts, all eager to see Justice Kagan in the first-term Texas. Lawmakers share the stage for a deep discussion on how authority moves between the branches of modern U.S. government. Representative Crockett, I need to address the way you previously described the court's recent decisions involving the Commerce Clause, Justice Kagan said in the sharp, precise tone that built her reputation as one of the judiciary's sharpest minds. You've suggested our rulings are driven by political motives rather than honest constitutional interpretation. But isn't it more accurate to acknowledge that Congress has increasingly stepped away from its constitutional duties by passing vague laws that hand off major policy choices to administrative agencies, that forces courts to define boundaries that elected lawmakers should have clearly established from the beginning? The way Kagan framed her challenge, shifting the discussion from judicial activism to congressional over-reliance on delegation, directly confronted Crockett's earlier criticism of recent Supreme Court decisions narrowing federal regulatory authority. For nearly 40 minutes, the panel had maintained a polite, academic tone, with each participant offering thoughtful commentary on the long-standing tension among Congress, the courts, and federal agencies. That calm atmosphere broke when Crockett, responding to a question about new limits placed on agency power, methodically outlined what she described as selective originalism and how the court applied the Commerce Clause. My concern isn't simply about differing constitutional interpretations, Crockett had said. It's about the court applying historical standards inconsistently, using them to reduce Congress's power while expanding judicial authority under the same constitutional text. That uneven approach creates the impression that history is being used to justify preferred outcomes rather than maintain uniform constitutional principles. Her argument, that the court was imposing historical restrictions on Congress while ignoring comparable historical limits on itself, clearly struck a sensitive point for Justice Kagan, whose own judicial philosophy often reflects a balance between preventing overreach by both courts and administrative agencies. Kagan's pointed question shifted responsibility back toward Congress, creating a rare moment of direct tension in an academic setting where challenging a sitting justice so openly is unusual due to the institution's deeply rooted norms and hierarchy. The audience, filled mostly with future lawyers and seasoned legal professionals, understood immediately how significant this moment was. The room fell silent as Crockett paused, fully aware she was being confronted by one of the Supreme Court's most respected figures. Though only in her first term, Crockett had earned recognition for her strong legal background and deep preparation, especially on constitutional issues. But responding to a Supreme Court justice, especially one with Justice Kagan's intellectual weight and institutional authority, was an entirely different challenge, leaving even experienced observers unsure of how she might navigate this high-pressure exchange. Crockett took a steadying breath, adjusted the papers in front of her, and met Justice Kagan's gaze with the calm focus she had shown throughout the event. Justice Kagan, I truly appreciate the depth of your question, she began, offering sincere respect for both Kagan's standing and the validity of her critique. You're absolutely right that Congress must do a better job drafting clear and specific legislation. I've personally pushed for tighter statutory language to reduce the need for heavy regulatory interpretation. This respectful acknowledgement, accepting Congress's role rather than immediately pushing back, shifted the tone from conflict to thoughtful dialogue and captured the full attention of the room. Seeing Kagan subtly nod in recognition, Crockett continued, However, I think both branches face structural challenges that call for shared responsibility, not one-sided blame. Congress must certainly improve its drafting, but courts should also consider whether applying historical limits to modern regulatory issues while expanding judicial oversight beyond historical boundaries creates inconsistencies that weaken overall constitutional stability. Her voice remained steady and controlled as she shaped her argument with careful precision. The historical record shows that the early Supreme Court exercised remarkable restraint in overturning Congress's economic judgments in Gibbons. Chief Justice Marshall held that the Commerce Clause is complete in itself, can be used to its fullest extent, and carries no limitations beyond those written directly into the Constitution. For more than a century, this broad interpretation of congressional authority under the Commerce Clause remained the dominant view, long before the more restrictive modern approach developed. That history raises a critical point, limiting Congress's commerce powers using the founders' understanding, while at the same time expanding judicial authority far beyond what the founders envisioned, creates the exact kind of methodological imbalance that fuels today's debates about institutional legitimacy. Then, with timing so precise it momentarily stunned the entire room, Representative Crockett offered her most striking insight yet. She explained that institutional credibility requires recognizing that neither branch has perfectly adhered to history. Congress, she acknowledged, has often drafted legislation that is overly broad, while the judiciary has frequently interpreted the Constitution in ways that move beyond traditional boundaries. Instead of placing blame on only one branch, she suggested that openly acknowledging this shared evolution might be the key to reviving the balance both Congress and the courts claim to defend. After all, constitutional trust depends on consistent principles rather than outcome-driven reasoning, a standard that must apply equally to lawmakers writing statutes and judges. Interpreting them, the room stayed completely silent as Crockett ended her remarks with what many legal analysts later described as a masterful shift, one that accepted Congress's shortcomings while gently highlighting the court's own selective historical reasoning. So, yes, Justice Kagan, Crockett concluded, I fully agree Congress must improve its drafting. But both institutions must also recognize that applying historical standards selectively, no matter which branch does it, weakens constitutional clarity. Our system is strengthened not by institutional victories, but by interpretive consistency that preserves public trust in constitutional governance, rather than flexible methods that appear tied to preferred results. This transformation, from a polite academic panel to a profound exchange about constitutional interpretation, created what scholars later called an exceptional moment of genuine institutional dialogue. As Justice Kagan's expression shifted from tension to appreciative reflection, the audience collectively realized they had witnessed something extraordinary, a first-term Congresswoman offering sharp, constitutional analysis of the courts methodology while simultaneously accepting responsibility for Congress's role, all while maintaining unwavering respect for institutional boundaries. Before we break down this remarkable confrontation that has sparked conversation across legal and political circles, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tap the notification bell so you never miss our deep dive coverage of the constitutional debates and high-stakes exchanges that mainstream outlets often ignore. Now, let's return to the pivotal moment where Representative Jasmine Crockett's measured, thoughtful response to Justice Elena Kagan's direct challenge didn't escalate tension. It transformed the entire discussion into a meaningful exploration of constitutional method, leaving the Harvard Law audience stunned by its balance, clarity, and mutual respect. Jasmine Crockett's path to that defining moment at Harvard Law was anything but traditional. Elected to Congress in 2022 after just one term in the Texas legislature, the 41-year-old attorney quickly emerged as one of the most serious voices on constitutional issues, despite her relatively recent arrival in Washington. What political commentators often missed when dismissing her as new to national politics was her long career in constitutional litigation and institutional analysis before stepping into public office. As a lawyer, Crockett became known for her disciplined approach to constitutional argument, prioritizing methodological consistency over outcome-based reasoning. She understood that true constitutional legitimacy comes from coherent principles applied evenly across cases, not selective interpretations shaped by political or ideological preferences. Even after entering Congress, she continued applying this methodical approach, grounding her arguments in interpretive consistency rather than partisan gain. Her effectiveness came not from political theatrics, but from demonstrating principled reasoning that remained stable across institutions. Justice Elena Kagan, on the other hand, had spent more than a decade on the Supreme Court, establishing herself as one of the court's sharpest thinkers, particularly on issues involving administrative law and separation of powers. Before joining the court, she served as the nation's first female Solicitor General and as Dean of Harvard Law School, earning a reputation for exceptional legal insight and pragmatic understanding of institutional structures. Throughout her judicial career, Kagan developed a method rooted in rigorous reasoning combined with institutional restraint, frequently questioning both unchecked administrative power and excessive judicial intervention, while consistently emphasizing that the court must not drift into policymaking. Justice Kagan's influence as a jurist comes from her ability to approach constitutional issues with both technical precision and a deep sense of how each interpretation affects the broader system. As one former Supreme Court clerk privately noted, her questioning often goes beyond abstract doctrine and zeroes in on the real-world institutional consequences of each constitutional approach. She consistently evaluates how different methods shape the balance between branches and the stability of constitutional governance in a wide range of situations. This institutional awareness explains why she pays such close attention to debates surrounding congressional delegation and judicial restraint, treating them as interconnected pillars of constitutional balance rather than separate legal concepts. The Harvard Law School distinguished lecture that brought Justice Kagan and Representative Crockett together was structured as a serious academic examination of separation of powers in today's governmental system. It focused on the evolving tensions between Congress's authority, the judiciary's role in constitutional review, and the growing importance of administrative agencies. The panel, which included Kagan, Crockett, and several top constitutional scholars, was specifically assembled to explore how these relationships have shifted over time and whether the current structure still maintains the balance envisioned by the Constitution. For the first 40 minutes, the discussion maintained the respectful tone expected in an academic setting. Participants presented careful and well-reasoned analyses rather than political arguments. Justice Kagan offered particularly thoughtful insight into administrative law, acknowledging the practical need for delegation in complex regulatory fields while also highlighting the constitutional dangers posed by agencies operating without clear legislative boundaries. The tone changed when Crockett responded to a question about the court's recent limits on agency power. She delivered a precise critique of what she called selective originalism in Commerce Clause cases. "My concern," she said, "is not genuine constitutional debate over regulatory limits. It is the court's inconsistent use of historical standards, applying them to shrink congressional authority while expanding judicial power rooted in the same constitutional language." Her argument that the court restricted Congress using historical reasoning while giving itself more power beyond historical limits suggested a methodological inconsistency rather than a simple disagreement with specific rulings. By emphasizing the importance of interpretive consistency over preferred results, Crockett rooted her criticism in constitutional principle instead of political or policy preferences. Ironically, this focus on method rather than outcome echoed themes that frequently appeared in Justice Kagan's own dissents. Because of this, Kagan's unexpected decision to directly challenge Crockett stood out. Her intervention shifted the focus back toward Congress by arguing that the real problem stemmed from vague legislative drafting rather than judicial interpretation. "Representative Crockett," Kagan said, "I must respond to your earlier description of the court's Commerce Clause cases. You've implied political motives behind our decisions. But isn't it more accurate to acknowledge that Congress has begun abandoning its constitutional role by writing imprecise laws that delegate essential policy decisions to administrative agencies?" Courts are then forced to draw the boundaries lawmakers should have clearly established. This reframing treating congressional overdelegation as the primary issue rather than judicial activism served as both a defense of the court and a significant intellectual challenge. It acknowledged the legitimacy of Crockett's concerns about institutional balance but redirected responsibility toward Congress's drafting practices. That positioning placed Crockett in a difficult yet meaningful moment. She had to recognize the validity of Kagan's criticism without abandoning her central argument about methodological inconsistency. When she began her reply, her first sentence set the tone for what became a notably substantive exchange. "Justice Kagan, I sincerely appreciate your thoughtful challenge," she said. "You've raised an important point about congressional drafting that absolutely deserves deeper consideration. Congress shares real responsibility for the imbalance we're discussing, and I've personally pushed for clearer statutory language to prevent over-reliance on regulatory interpretation." This initial acknowledgement, accepting Congress's role instead of shifting blame, demonstrated both institutional awareness and genuine engagement with the substance of Kagan's critique, setting the stage for the deeper exchange that followed. By openly agreeing that Congress bears part of the responsibility and by pointing to her own push for clearer legislative language, Crockett showed a willingness to accept valid criticism rather than defaulting to institutional defensiveness. This response strengthened her credibility and avoided feeding the impression of political posturing. As Justice Kagan's expression reflected appreciation for the acknowledgement, Crockett shifted the conversation by reframing their disagreement through the lens of shared institutional responsibility instead of assigning fault to only one branch. However, she continued, both branches face similar institutional challenges that require mutual recognition, not one-sided correction. Yes, Congress must write more precise statutes, but courts also need to consider whether applying historical limits to modern regulatory issues while expanding judicial review beyond the boundaries recognized in earlier eras creates the kind of inconsistency that weakens constitutional coherence. This reframing, which emphasized that both Congress and the judiciary wrestle with maintaining methodological consistency, transitioned the discussion from blame toward a shared responsibility for protecting constitutional structure. By acknowledging Congress's shortcomings while gently encouraging the court to examine its own selective use of historical interpretation, Crockett outlined a framework centered on mutual institutional improvement rather than unilateral critique. It was a far more constructive approach, one that highlighted her commitment to constitutional integrity above institutional advantage, without raising her voice. But with striking clarity, she then provided historical evidence that demonstrated how the judiciary itself had evolved far beyond its founding-era boundaries. She reminded the audience that early Supreme Court decisions rarely overturned congressional economic judgments, citing Chief Justice Marshall's landmark statement in Gibbons v. Ogden that the Commerce Clause grants power, complete in itself, capable of being exercised to its fullest extent, subject only to the limitations expressly written into the Constitution. This expansive understanding of congressional commerce authority remained largely untouched for more than a century before the modern court introduced narrower interpretations. Crockett explained that this history raises a serious question. If the court restricts Congress using the Founders' framework while simultaneously expanding judicial review beyond the Founders' intentions, doesn't that create the very methodological inconsistency at the center of today's legitimacy concerns? By grounding her argument in specific history, particularly Gibbons and the court's long-standing deference to congressional authority, Crockett demonstrated that the judiciary has evolved significantly from its original limitations. This made her critique more than theoretical. It became a concrete challenge to selective originalism that narrows congressional power while permitting judicial authority to grow past comparable historical boundaries. Then, with impeccable timing that momentarily froze the room, She introduced her most important point about shared institutional responsibility. She observed that true constitutional legitimacy requires acknowledging that neither branch has perfectly adhered to historical practice. Congress has often drafted overly broad laws, and the judiciary has frequently stretched its interpretive role beyond the limits understood by the founders. Recognizing that both branches have evolved, rather than placing blame solely on one, might help restore the constitutional balance both institutions claim to value. She reminded the audience that stable constitutional governance depends on principled consistency that goes beyond achieving preferred results. That standard, she emphasized, must apply equally to those who legislate and those who interpret. Her balanced perspective, recognizing imperfections in both branches, reinforced a framework of mutual institutional improvement rather than competitive fault-finding. The entire auditorium remained silent as she concluded with a masterful redirection that accepted Congress's responsibility while subtly calling attention to the court's own selective approach to historical interpretation. So yes, Justice Kagan, she said, I completely agree that Congress must improve its legislative precision. But both branches must also recognize that selective use of historical standards harms constitutional coherence no matter who applies it. What strengthens our constitutional structure isn't institutional victory. It's interpretive consistency that builds public trust, not methodological flexibility that mirrors desired outcomes. This concluding perspective focused on shared improvement instead of institutional competition brought full circle Crockett's transformation of what could have been a tense confrontation into a thoughtful, principled discussion of constitutional method. By emphasizing Congress's duty to draft clearly while highlighting the need for both branches to apply consistent interpretive standards, she demonstrated a commitment to constitutional principles over institutional gain, precisely the standard that had shaped her critique from the beginning. The shift from what first looked like a routine academic panel into a meaningful discussion about constitutional methods created a moment scholars later described as one of the most striking examples of genuine institutional dialogue. The exchange exposed inconsistencies in constitutional interpretation, yet it unfolded with complete professionalism and mutual respect. When Justice Kagan reacted with a mix of surprise, appreciation, and focused reflection, the tension in the room eased as everyone realized they were witnessing something rare, serious constitutional critique delivered without hostility, rooted entirely in principle, not politics. After thinking carefully, Justice Kagan addressed Representative Crockett with appreciation. She said that Crockett's point about maintaining a consistent interpretive approach was valid and worth serious consideration by both branches of government. Although she still believed Congress's drafting practices play a significant role in today's structural challenges, she agreed Crockett raised legitimate concerns about selective use of historical standards, concerns courts should not ignore. She added that progress might require clearer legislation and more stable, judicial methods that recognize how institutions evolve rather than relying on selectively chosen historical limits. She emphasized that constitutional conversations become stronger when both branches engage with the kind of principled clarity Crockett demonstrated. This response showed how seriously Justice Kagan took Crockett's argument. She recognized the value of Crockett's critique while still holding her own view about congressional responsibility. Instead of minimizing comments from a junior member of Congress or responding defensively, Justice Kagan addressed the issue of methodological consistency directly. It was a perfect example of the kind of respectful, principle-driven engagement that strengthens constitutional dialogue even when participants disagree on specifics. For the rest of the panel, the tone noticeably shifted. Though participants continued to disagree on various constitutional issues, they focused far more on consistent methodology across all branches instead of defending institutional turf. Both Justice Kagan and Representative Crockett referenced each other several times, showing respect for each other's concerns about constitutional coherence. Observers later described the event as a model of how institutions can communicate thoughtfully and constructively about constitutional interpretation. What we just saw was extraordinary, one constitutional law professor said afterward. He explained that Representative Crockett didn't simply give a strong answer to Justice Kagan's challenge, she shifted the entire direction of the panel. What might have turned into a competition between branches became a sincere discussion about constitutional consistency. Crockett didn't ignore concerns about Congress, nor did she attack the court. Instead, she acknowledged Congress's weaknesses while still pressing for consistency in judicial methodology, no matter which branch might benefit. This kind of principle-centered approach, he said, is exactly what meaningful constitutional governance requires. By that evening, clips of the exchange had gone viral across academic and governance networks. Crockett-Kagan exchange set's model for constitutional dialogue began trending among legal scholars and policy experts. They highlighted both the sharp insight behind the conversation and the extraordinary level of institutional respect shown by both women. One professor noted, "This exchange reveals something important about constitutional governance. Real constitutional dialogue requires willingness to address criticism honestly and apply consistent standards, even when doing so is uncomfortable." What made the moment stand out wasn't only the depth of the ideas, it was the proof that constitutional principle can rise above institutional rivalry when participants truly engage with methodology instead of defending power. By recognizing Congress's shortcomings while still challenging inconsistent judicial methods, Representative Crockett showed how real constitutional dialogue should work grounded in fairness, consistency, and respect. This is exactly the kind of approach needed in a time of growing institutional division. If you found this deep dive into one of the most meaningful constitutional exchanges helpful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss our breakdowns of major moments that show how principled thinking can strengthen constitutional governance. And share your thoughts in the comments about methodological consistency, constitutional interpretation, and why applying the same standards across institutions matters more than ever.